so much, Your Excellency, First Lady Jeanette Kagame. If I may share, First Lady Monica Gangos of Namibia, First Lady Michelle Obama of the United States, where I reside, and you, First Lady Jeanette Kagame, are truly forever First Ladies. To myself and to many women around the world, particularly women of color, representation truly matters, particularly for Black and brown girls and women around the world. And First Lady Jeanette, you show up very powerfully but gracefully in your roles as the First Ladies of your respective countries. I just wanted to get it out there, so thank you so much for indulging me. I've always wanted to do that. Welcome to our esteemed guests locally, regionally, and around the world. Again, Your Excellency, First Lady of the Republic of Rwanda, captains of industry in our audience, and distinguished guests, all protocols observed. I'm truly honored and very excited to moderate this panel, The Business Case for Women in FinTech. For some background to this topic, I am an African female founder of a FinTech startup, and we're based in the United States. We plan on operating across the region. I am part of the 1.5% of global FinTech startups founded by women. However, women founders get approximately 1% of overall VC venture capital funding, just 1%. I am also cautiously optimistic because as an African female founder of a FinTech startup, we represent 2.3% of FinTechs founded by African women, double the global average of just 1.6%. It is against this gloomy backdrop, our amazing panelists will focus on the following themes: access to capital and raising capital, two very separate challenges, skills development and talent pipeline, and community and enabling ecosystem. So to my panelists, we are in 2023, and yet this topic and challenge persists. Inez, you are CEO of Financial Alliance for Women and previously spent 17 years with the Women's World Banking. The video we just watched, STEM is made up of 28% of women. So why is having more women founders in FinTech important? And I'll start with you, and then I'll get over to Marlon.
Okay, great question. And I suppose we have to look at ourselves as human beings and acknowledge we have some limitations. And one of our limitations is that we like people like ourselves. So we have an affinity for people that look and sound like ourselves. And that is the essence of the problem of only having 1.5% of FinTech started by women, is that you're never going to have a fully inclusive financial system and customer base unless you have an inclusive leadership of the industry. So that plays out in the following ways. If you look at use of FinTechs globally, for every 100 men using a FinTech, there's only 72 women using a FinTech. So that gender gap in use of FinTech is 3 times as large as it is in terms of using mobile phones or in access to bank accounts. We did a survey in 2020 of 168 FinTechs globally and asked about their attitudes towards targeting what we call the female economy. The female economy, by the way, is worth $216 trillion. So the fact that women are 51-odd% of the population, let us say, the growing economic power of the female economy, there's loads and loads of statistics about it. So for instance, women are starting up businesses at greater rates than men globally. They are getting more educated than boys are, which of course is a problem in many ways for boys, but what I'm saying is that they are going to be earning money, so they're an enormous market. And we're seeing the biggest transfer of wealth in human history currently happening in the United States between the baby boomers and our generation. And that transfer is predominantly going to women, or the majority of that wealth is going to women because women inherit from their fathers and then they inherit from their husbands. So it's a massive market that's growing. But most of the FinTechs that we surveyed actually don't even look at the women's market. They don't even know that there is a women's market and that men and women think differently when it comes to access and use of financial services. So to give you a flavor of what that actually means, it means that not only do we have an access gap, but when we're looking at the sales funnel of the fintechs, we're not seeing women come through the sales funnel in the same way as men are. But all we need to do really is disaggregate the data and look at the sales funnel and say, how do we actually get equality in the percentage of male and females through that sales funnel? And there are lots of best practice out there, but one I would like to call out is Time Bank from South Africa that's in the audience here and is a sponsor of this event. And Time has a model that really personifies how you need to think about the female economy and get women in. And one thing, for starters, is to have trust with the community. Women aren't going to go into your fintech if they don't know who you are. You need to establish trust and be in the community. So the physical model that Time has combined digital kiosks with a human ambassador in storefronts, in stores, where women actually are shopping every day, and enable a non-bank person through biometrics to be onboarded into a bank account within 3 minutes without any documentation. And that physical ambassador, that human, is supporting in that process, but also educating more about what kind of products and services that they're using. Then you get to the next stage of considering, will I use that for a normal fintech, right? Will I use the fintech? A lot of fintechs actually, from regulators' perspective, have a whole bunch of things that people need to sign off on in order to agree to being onboarded, right? Women tend to read all the detail. So by the time they go through all the things they need to go through, they're turned off. Men don't read through any of the detail. They just click the button, move on to the next stage. Then you get to approval. Approval, for instance, for a loan. You know, there's a lot of talk now about bias within algorithms. Well, it's real. Because if two of the core metrics that you're evaluating a human on is the economic status and their income, structural reasons mean that women are disadvantaged. So we need to unpack those biases in the sales funnel and get more women through. And finally, thinking about women not just as entrepreneurs or as homemakers. Women, as her excellently rightly pointed out, have multiple roles. So they are, in fact, the chief purchasing officer in the household. And so when it comes to those things like lifetime value, women are actually really, really good customers. So I think getting the business case out there is an important way. And going back to the original question, having diversity in the leadership and workforce of those fintechs is a really important way to encourage fintechs to focus on the women's market.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Inez. I'll turn the same question over to you, Marlon. I'm curious to hear from you as a managing director over a VC, and you have a global footprint. So what are your thoughts on making the case for more women as founders? What are you seeing come across your table in terms of pitch decks, et cetera?
Sure, thanks, Farai. Firstly, I think it's important to say the main reason for doing this is it's the right thing to do, right? So you can't have half of society excluded from whether it's fintech, private equity, investing, across the piece is the right thing to do. So that's the first thing to say. Second thing is maybe be useful if I highlight the scale of the issue that we're facing. So as an investor across the African continent, we probably look at between 120 to 140 investments in order to make one investment. And the number of female-led companies, on average, within that 120 to 140 who come to us with ideas, with a business model, et cetera, is less than 1%. So you start to see the scale of the issue to begin with, which is that sitting on our side of the fence, we need to find a way to encourage first of all, female ownership of businesses, and then secondly, this is really important, it sounds crazy, but the courage to come and talk to investors such as us. It's not that the opportunity set isn't there, it's not that the talent isn't there, it is. But part of it is just having the courage to, and understanding what people like us look for, rather. And so, you know, we are a relatively new, we manage the Virunga Fund, which is domiciled here in Rwanda in the KIFC. If you look at, we started off very purposefully by trying to address this issue, first within our business. So if you look at our key SKUs when we're looking at an investment company, we've got two key SKUs. First one is financial inclusion. The second one is gender equality. And secondly, within our own business, if you look at how the recruitment has done, we're at about 45% in terms of female recruitment, which is a good start. Now, if I'm being honest with that, that 45% is a bit skewed towards the more inexperienced folks because it's very difficult to find experienced talent. So one of the things that we're trying to do within our fund is to act as a incubator for female talent. That's number one. And number two, it's quite useful to have females within the team because they just bring a completely different perspective. So I'll give you a practical example. A lady's just joined our investment committee. We had an all-male investment committee to start with for the first two investments. How she processes things, how she thinks about issues, risks, opportunities is completely different. And so there's a real practical advantage to having diversity in your business. I do think it will take time because what we are paid for ultimately is our judgments on investments. And that judgment takes time to develop, to do it well. So I think, first of all, we've got to start off with intentionality. So it's important people at the senior levels within each of these funds or fintechs, if you like, are very focused on the issue. And then secondly, you need to see that implementation within the organizations. And then ours is a long-term game. 10, 15 years' time, you'll start to see a significant difference.
Thank you. Very sobering to hear that less than 1% out of the 120 to 140 are female-founded startups. Very sobering. My next question is for Honorable Minister Paula, and to you, Max. You had the technology and innovation here in Rwanda, and Max, you are the head of the UNDP. I'm wondering, what do you think are the biggest challenges facing female tech entrepreneurs or tech founders? And this is against the backdrop of what Inez and Marlon have shared with us. What are you saying would be some of these challenges that perhaps we could then talk about solutions after?
Thank you very much. I think even just looking at the theme of IFF 2023, which is really around inclusion, I think that's the very first big challenge that most women or female entrepreneurs continue to face. And while inclusion is a big, word in itself, I think if you break it down, you're looking at the biases that have been talked about, that we see most female entrepreneurs, female founders continue to face. But I think the bigger one is always going to be access to capital, and we'll come back to that later. And so the funding gap is a big one. And when we look at financing more generally, there's the funding gap, but there's also the pay gap. Earlier this year, when we were looking at the statistics around the gender pay gap, first of all, you have women make up 30% of the workforce in the tech sector. So that's just a third of the workforce. But even when they're in those roles, what they are paid compared to male that are in similar roles is significantly lower. And if you're going to think about women, let's talk about financing, bootstrapping, where you're going to sort of figure out where do I get the funding to get my business started, you're already paid less than a female, than a male that is in a similar role. So it almost already means that when you start a business, you're already at a disadvantage if you don't have all these different pools of access to capital. And then the other bit is always around the barriers that they continue to face around access to capital. And we'll see many of those which will stem from, do we have female-led VCs that can actually advocate and support female entrepreneurs and founders, understanding the kind of challenges that they face, and we'll come back to those. And we also continue to see significantly low numbers of female-founded VCs. Just to share a statistic, I think we earlier talked about having just 1 out of 140. This year, when you look at the Disrupt Africa statistics, you have 20% of tech-funded startups that at least have one woman. And we're not talking about female-led, because I think there's always a difference between, is it an all-female-led startup versus a mixed-gender startup. And while we see only, less than 2% of an all-female-led startups in place, when we skew the numbers and look at the mixed gender, then you sort of start to see close to 17%. But that's for startups that are able to show proof that at least they have one woman on the team that is part of the startup. But I think what was very interesting is to look at the 633 startups that were reviewed in Africa, and only 128 of them, at least had a woman in the startup. So already the pool is small of female-led startups, leave alone the fact that even a lesser percentage, which is probably 2.7% of those that are actually going to find access to capital. So I think those are the two major challenges that most of the female founders continue to face. Perhaps to close on this is when we look at the tech space, again, I think it all comes back to education. How many young girls are getting into STEM areas or STEM fields? Because if you have fewer girls that are getting into STEM fields, that are going through the education channel and eventually owning and starting businesses, then eventually the problem will continue, you will continue to see the problem in different facets of even building businesses. So as we think about solutions, it's really going back to the foundations of how do we encourage more young girls and women to pursue STEM education and STEM career. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And yes, bootstrapping for us is actually a reality, and we are bootstrapping from a very low income base. And to Marlon's point, pitching to people that look like myself is also very key. So having female-founded VCs is also quite critical. Max, over to you as head of UNDP. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges that female tech entrepreneurs are facing? You do a lot of work. I mean, literally, coming into the country as an international visitor, I was told you got to meet Max because of the work that you're doing. And I know a lot of people that I've spoken with have said, we want to meet with Max Gomera because you're doing significant work in really, I think, catalyzing the population.
Thank you, Farai. You're very kind.
Welcome.
And I share your admiration and respect for First Lady Kagame and the leaders that you have mentioned here. They inspire me from many different angles. Inez, you're absolutely right. As humans, I think we have a surprising capacity to have a preference for biases that tend not to be very helpful, but we think that they are working for us. And nowhere is that bias more particular than in the area that you mentioned, Honorable Ingabire, in terms of access to capital. And I want to build a little bit on that point and look at the rules of engagement, the rules of the game that we've built around access to capital and access to credit. Now, I was born in a little town in Zimbabwe, it's called Kadoma, and my mother was a greengrocer. She sold tomatoes for all of us, for the whole family, to have a living. Everybody in that town thought my mother was wrong until she was right. My mother went to every bank in town looking for credit to scale her business, and no one would give her credit. She was considered an informal business person, and she was a woman. Yet my mother did everything that every modern business person is doing today. Whenever I came back from school, I was amazed at how my mother kept copious quantities of notes on her customers. She would know that if you deliver to Mrs. Jones, she would like these types of tomatoes. She wants them 3 times a week. She will pay after 2 weeks. To my mind, and if Diane is still here, my mother invented Know Your Customer before the banks did. But not only that, she bought me and my sister 2 bicycles to deliver the tomatoes.
Yeah.
Today we speak of Uber Eats and Vuba Vuba as if they are new inventions. But it was my mother who came up with that. yet no one would believe in her. And no one would give her credit because she just didn't fit the risk profile that banks were using at that time. And that is the problem. And when you look at the banks, with all due respect, the banks that we have in Africa, what they have done is to take the rules that were applicable to England 200 years ago, when England had small and medium-scale enterprises, and we've just planted them here. Now, when Napoleon wanted to upset the British, he said, they are a nation of greengrocers.
Yeah.
What he didn't understand at the time, and the question was, where do we locate Europe's financial capital? So how can we locate it in a country where this is a nation of greengrocers, basically?
Yeah.
But what he misunderstood at the time was that the financial services system was evolving to serve the kinds of business people that England had at that time. And when these farmers began to grow, we saw the likes of Sainsbury, we saw the likes of Tesco, we saw the likes of these big businesses, and then we saw the emergence of bigger banks, Lloyds, Barclays. What we as Africans missed is that we cannot take Barclays' rules today in England and apply the same profile to people like my mother. So that's what we need to change. My mother could have scaled her business if someone had believed in her that she can do so, but she was denied that opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and shout out to all the... Thank you so much, Max, for sharing, and shout out to all the African mothers. I certainly can relate to that. Innovation truly came from them. I think the theme that's emerging from this conversation is access to capital. So the next question for really my panel is what can be done to scale up? So scale up. So access is there, but how do we scale up access to capital for women like myself? And just to provide context, I am also having to think about how do I get funding for my own startup. So I have 2 masters. I had to work hard, and one of my masters is from Harvard. I'm a young global leader with the World Economic Forum, and yet and still, it's tough to convince investors on why they should invest in me because of the female factor. So what should we be thinking? I know you mentioned courage. I think I have a little bit of a courage. I mean, I'm speaking in front of the First Lady of an entire country, so a little bit of courage there, right? I did work up the nerve actually to be on stage, so. But what can be done to scale it up so then women who don't have my credentials can also have the same opportunity to present to a Marlon or to talk to Max or even to the minister herself or you, Inez? So any one of you can start.
So maybe I'll have a go here. I think actually it's leading on, following on from Max's point. What we need as African FinTech investors and African investors more broadly is the right set of tools to be making those investments. So today, what do I mean? Today, if you look at most funds, VC funds, private equity funds, what is their cost of capital? They're funded in US dollars. That doesn't make any sense in our markets. So if you are there trying to invest in a local company, pick the country, African country, it almost doesn't matter. You start off anywhere between -3 and -5% every single year because your funding cost is in US dollars. So the first thing, and the main thing actually, if you want to transform our space and actually build a very strong FinTech and more broadly private equity system across the African continent, is we need local funding, not international funding. That's the first point. And the good news is that local funding actually exists. My own bugbear on this is we have a misallocation of capital within a lot of our countries, not all of them, but most of them, where we should have a thriving FinTech and private equity industry in almost all countries. Why? Look around the world at the countries that have been successful in building a FinTech or a private equity ecosystem. It's local money that drives it initially. So the way to success is you get local money, that local money is invested well, international money sees, oh, there's returns here. And then they come in and they go out, they come in and they go out, but they'll ultimately stay eventually. So what we need is local money. Where does that local money come from? The pension fund sector.
Okay.
So you look at the United States, if you split it up into, yes, there's foundations, there's this, there's a whole bunch of different, but actually the heart of where significant capital comes from in the United States is the pension fund sector. If you look across the African continent, with the exception of South Africa, I would say there is not a consistently applied pension activity in our sector. And so even if you just took 1 to 2% and made it mandatory, actually, 1 to 2%, 1 to 3% of pension funds locally have to be invested in the FinTech space or the private equity space, almost overnight, you'd have a transformational outcome. And then and then specifically what you then do, because we're going through a similar process, what you then do is you mandate that the pension funds have to have the right sorts of policies in place. What does that mean? So it means that they need to ensure that there's a sufficient proportion of women within each GP or within each organization that they will back. Very important. So they lay out what the percentages are. Almost at every level you can do that. Number two, make sure that your economic rewards are aligned between male and female. Very important as well. There's no reason why there should be any disparity other than experience. And then thirdly, we can talk about ownership and these sorts of things. But the solution is actually, it's right in our hands. It's making sure that the pension funds have an allocation of a minimum of 3%, I would say, but let's start with 2 and see where we get to. And also linked to that allocation is that there are some very clear gender requirements if you want to attract capital.
Yeah. And really, too, it's also ordinary workers who fund the pension funds.
Absolutely.
So I do agree with you that we have to mandate them in how they direct the capital. Any of the panelists would want to speak to that question?
Perhaps what I could add is even coming back to what are those actual barriers that are driving basically this lack of access to capital. So I think starting with the policy side, there's obviously the investments that we need to make in women and girls, so we at least can expand the pipeline of female-founded startups and businesses. So even starting with very basic things that we've done here in Rwanda, which involves how do we ensure that we have more girls getting into STEM fields. We have the Coding Academy where we've ensured that every year we bring in students, top performers, we have a 50-50 split. But then it also goes beyond that, also thinking about, because essentially when you're thinking about access to capital, it has different layers. Early stage financing, pre-seed is really the starting. That's where you start to get the dreams and ideas and mold them into something that then becomes attractive for the VCs. Yes. So, and that's pretty much an area that most governments space that the governments are going to be playing in. So being very deliberate and intentional about bringing on board more women. I think more than 10 years ago in Rwanda, in the financial industry, we had more male leading the banks. Today we have more women. So perhaps even thinking about curating a fund that is very specific and deliberate about supporting women entrepreneurs. Yes, people make noise, but you have more women and funded startups that can then really make an impact. And then I think the other thing is also, and perhaps it's a call to all of us, when we think about the fact that you have most VCs that are male-led, the question then becomes, what happens to those few VCs that have females at the helm of them? This year's theme of Women's Day, International Women's Day, was around digital. And I remember someone who said something very specific around, if you're not at the, and we hear it a lot, if you're not at the table, you're the menu. But then if you flip it, if you're not at the table and you don't want to be the menu, pull your chair, make your own table. Exactly. So can we build our own startup funds that support women?
Absolutely.
Could I build on that?
Please.
Because I think it's really important to distinguish the stage of the business, right? So if you're in pre-seed, you're looking at pre-seed, startup, Series A, you know, what I think we need to do, because the banks are never going to serve that, okay? They cannot serve a business that's less than 3 years old in general. And it is true that in this part of the particular part of Africa, you have a lot of also additional requirements like collateral, which is very hard for women, like land title and so on, for cultural reasons or whatever. But basically the banks in the UK or anywhere else do not serve the startups. So a piece that needs to be filled in is the angel investing community, right? So you're not going to become a VC overnight. Like, you know, you need a lot of business experience and acumen and so on. It's not like it's a career path that is difficult, and ultimately we will get there. But angel is something that you can do. You're talking about a $10,000 investment, you know, where you're basically a coach, a mentor for the investee, for the woman. And you can even do syndicates, which are very interesting, where you can contribute $1,000. And you're part of a syndicate of maybe 100. And you're also getting involved and schooled in how to advise and so on. So because it's not just capital, right? It's all of the other things that you need as an entrepreneur to be coached and mentored, linked, networked. All of that kind of stuff has to happen. So I think if I was a policymaker, totally agree with you on the fund, but I also think thinking about creating angel networks and supporting the creation, because there's loads of women now that have money because they're high level in banks and so on. They are perfect to target and cultivate to support on an angel basis.
That is so key. It's not just capital that we need. It's the mentorship. It's championing women. Is bringing up my name in rooms where you have access. You may have access, but I don't have access. You have access. So I agree with you completely. Max, did you want to add to the conversation?
Perhaps I could just give 2 examples, because I think there's reason for hope. And I've seen some wonderful things that are happening here in Rwanda. The other side, I mean, you're absolutely right about pension funds, but the other side of the coin is to mobilize savings. And women traditionally have been known, you know, for running the chamas. I think they call them in Kenya, and here there's a different name for them. And what I've seen young people like Exius who are looking at how do we mimic the traditional process that women use to make the decisions? How do we infuse the trust currency that women use to lend to each other and to mobilize financing digitally? And the FinTech world has done an amazing job, and now they are able to mop up a lot of the financing that would have been in pillows or under the beds, and bringing it onto the market and making it available to women entrepreneurs, and they decide who gets the money. The second thing is what I've seen Momo here doing, and I think M-Pesa is doing the same in Kenya. And that's looking at people's spending patterns on their mobile phones and deciding a new credit risk rating for them. Now that is fundamental, because if you think of it, if you are in a country like this one, like any other on the African continent, your only way of having a credit record is to go to a bank to borrow money in the first place. Now, if the bank is not able to lend you that money, how are you going to do that? I mean, most of the shops around here do not have credit facilities for people, unlike in other parts of the world. So by looking at how people are spending with Momo and with other facilities, I think they are disrupting this space.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I want to share the following stats. From 2013 to 2021, less than 5% of the total 12.6 billion in funding to African tech startups went to female-founded teams, compared to 82% that went to the male founding team. So 5% of $12.6 billion is a tiny, tiny fraction. As we close out this session, I'd like to get at least 1 or 2 points from each of the panelists. What is your call to action for people in the audience today? We have policymakers. We certainly have a First Lady. We have bankers. We have policymakers and regulators. We have tech founders and investors to advance financial inclusion in 2023. So what is your call to action? How can we rally the people in the room? Inez, you can get started.
So for financial inclusion, as opposed to, let's say, women leading fintechs, they're not mutually exclusive, but they're not necessarily the same thing. For financial inclusion, all I would ask the fintechs in the room is to look at their sales funnel and disaggregate their customer base by sex and ask the question why more women aren't coming into the funnel and moving through the funnel. It's actually a very simple analytical exercise. Most of the fintechs that we interviewed have that data. They've just never looked at it. So data is very important to drive decisions, as it is to drive policy making by policymakers. So my call would be to sex disaggregate the data.
Thanks. I'll go next. For me, it's very simple. If you want to change or improve significantly the ecosystem that we see around the African continent, we need to reduce our cost of capital. And so what that simply means is that we need more of our own capital coming back. I sound like a broken record, but coming back to the pension funds again, and banks, because typically what happens in a lot of our economies is the banks or the pension funds, what they do is they take policyholder money, and I might get into trouble today, but they take policyholder money and they put it in treasuries. Mm-hmm. They put it in treasuries. When it should be, well, if we can utilize it well, it would do far better both in terms of return and in terms of economic development and growth if it was actually going directly into the economy. And so if there's one big request, if that's the right word, that would be the big one. Linked to that, specifically around women, I would then say, if we can get there on the pension funds being more, or the capital providers in the economy being more actually active in our economy, linking that to certain and very clear and very specific and very actionable and very achievable gender-related goals.
Thank you, Marlon. Honourable Minister.
I think, First Lady, you gave us a perfect call to action in your remarks today, which is really the no's that we have to say, no at being a guest, at using our gender as a handicap, but also, the many yeses, especially at being at the table. And perhaps in line with the theme today, I would say the biggest call to action we should all have is how do we move away from the 1.9% that are funded, that get VC funded, and even particularly for Rwanda, just to commit that we'll do our part to at least have a double digit of that, having more women-funded startups, and I see so many bankers in the room, so for me it's a policy statement, and the rest is the support that we'll all work together, and to say that partnerships are really what will make it happen, and no single player will do it on their own.
Thank you. Max, over to you.
Thank you. For me, I'll have 3 takeaways for 3 groups of people. To the brilliant tech entrepreneurs here, help us to democratize access to finance, and we can do it. If we have done amazing things such as AI, this should be a walk in the park. That's number 1. Number 2, for the bankers around here, let's change the rules. The rules that we're using right now are not a law of physics. They are not something that we cannot change. We made the rules, we can change them. And third, to governments, Honorable Minister, take a stand for your people. There's no shame in saying we should allocate so much money and make sure that women who don't have access to devices have access to devices. We do it on many other priorities. Let's take a stand for this one.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Honourable Minister Paula, to Inez, Max, and to Marlon. I thank you so much for your thought leadership, innovative insights, and your time and presence here today. We've heard from you, and we've been challenged, and we've been invigorated by the ideas and new ways of thinking that you have shared with us. Most importantly, I believe we've been inspired to action by your responses to our last question on your call to action to us. In summary, we have to establish trust and be in the community. The courage for the founders here, the female founders here, the courage to pitch to VCs, investors, get some courage. You've mentioned, Marlon, reduce cost of capital, but also use local capital as well. That's really a big theme that came out. We also discovered that actually KYC and AI was really created by Max's mother and most African women. And then finally, to really change the rules of banking, to really figure out our ways of doing and then applying the rules based upon how we live our lives. Finally, First Lady Jeanette Kagame, your words are also a rallying cry. You said, inclusion of women in FinTech must be compulsory, must be intentional, and must be systemic. Otherwise, we are not just failing women, but we are failing everyone. Thank you so much for that rallying cry.